I am standing beside my mother's portrait, while my sister tells a room full of mourners that I stole the ring from our mother's hand. My father, Richard Mercer, did not stop her. He stood near the fireplace in his dark suit, one hand around a paper cup of coffee gone cold, and let Dana say it in front of cousins, neighbors, and the women who had brought casseroles I knew none of us would eat. The betrayal was not vague. It was precise. They told everyone at my mother's memorial that I had taken the one thing she loved most, and they said it with her portrait only a few feet away. I left that house with a small suitcase, my mother's ring on my hand, and no one willing to believe me. If this story touched you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it today. On the easel beside the piano was the portrait my mother had commissioned the year before she died. It showed her seated in a pale blue chair, with Dana on one side and me on the other. Most people noticed our faces first. My mother's soft smile, Dana's lifted chin, the way I looked straight ahead as if I had already learned not to ask for too much. But the truth had been sitting in plain sight the whole time. It was there in our hands. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. My name was Claire Mercer, and by the time my mother died, I had already spent most of my life learning how to survive in rooms where love was always being measured and handed out unevenly. Dana was 2 years older than I was, and had always known how to stand where the light found her first. My father liked that about her. He liked polished things. He liked stories that made the family look whole from the outside. Dana had the right laugh, the right hair, the right way of nodding when he spoke, as if every sentence out of his mouth deserved agreement. I was quieter. I noticed details. I remembered promises after everyone else had moved on from them. When I was 10, my father bought Dana a piano because she mentioned one after dinner. That same winter, I needed a new coat and was told mine still buttoned, so it was fine. I remember standing in the hallway mirror with the sleeves too short at my wrists, listening to Dana practice scales while my mother folded laundry in the next room with her mouth pressed thin. My mother, Ellen Mercer, was not cruel. That almost made it harder. She had a way of lowering her eyes instead of arguing. She smoothed tablecloths when tension filled the room. She crossed her arms lightly at the wrist when my father spoke over me, as though containing herself required both hands. Her passivity left a different kind of bruise. You could not point to it, but you lived inside it. Some families do not throw you out all at once. They do it an inch at a time. By the time I was grown, the pattern had become so ordinary that no one even pretended not to see it. Dana was invited into conversations about the house, the savings, the medical decisions. I was called when someone needed a ride to an appointment or help carrying boxes from the garage. When my mother got sick for the second time, I was the one sitting beside her during the long treatment afternoons, rubbing lotion into her hands because the medicine dried her skin until it cracked near the knuckles. Dana posted cheerful updates online about family strength and stopped by just long enough to take photos of flowers people sent. I did not say much about any of it. I made soup. I drove my mother to appointments. I learned how to read the set of her shoulders when the pain was worse than she wanted to admit. In those hours, when my father was at work and Dana had another excuse, my mother and I had the kind of quiet that felt almost honest. The ring became part of those afternoons. It had belonged to my grandmother Rose, a small emerald set in a thin gold band worn nearly smooth on the underside. It was not flashy. You could miss it if you were not paying attention. My mother used to turn it around her finger when she was thinking. As a child, I watched her do it at the kitchen window while rain slid down the glass and the house went still. A few months before she died, she asked me to drive her to a portrait sitting at a studio downtown. Dana was supposed to meet us there, but she arrived late. My father came for the final hour and spent most of it on calls in the hallway. I remember the smell of paint and old wood. I remember my mother looking tired under the bright lamps. At one point, while the artist adjusted the chair and Dana stepped away to fix her lipstick, my mother reached for my hand. "Hold still," she said softly. Then she slipped the ring from her own finger onto mine. I looked at her, confused, and she only squeezed my hand once. "It belongs with the daughter who sees what matters," she said. I told her I could not take it. She smiled in that sad little way she had when she was asking for something and apologizing for it at the same time. "You're not taking it," she said. "I'm giving it." Dana returned before I could answer. The artist asked us all to sit exactly as we were. My mother's hand stayed over my wrist. My hand rested in my lap. The ring caught the light for one brief second, and I remember thinking I would tell my father later, when the room was calm and my mother could back me up. But calm never lasted long in our house. Then she got weaker. Then there were medications. Then there were forms and appointments and one hospital stay after another. I kept waiting for the right time. There wasn't one. At the memorial, Dana said it as if she had been rehearsing it all morning. "She took it," she told my Aunt Patricia, loudly enough for 3 other people to hear. "Mom wore that ring every day. Now suddenly Claire has it, and no one knows when it disappeared." My aunt's eyes widened. She looked at my hand, then away. My father crossed the room toward me with that tight expression he used when he wanted obedience to look like reason. "Take it off," he said quietly. I stared at him. "She gave it to me." Dana laughed once under her breath. "Of course that's what you'd say." I told him about the studio. I told him the ring had been mine since the portrait sitting. I told him Mom had put it on my finger herself. He did not call me a liar. He did something colder. He said there was no proof. Silence can sound like guilt when the wrong person is speaking. A few neighbors pretended not to hear. One cousin bent over the dessert table as though brownie squares had suddenly become urgent. My father asked me again to take the ring off. When I refused, he said we would handle it after everyone left. But I wasn't prepared for what happened next. After the last car pulled away and the house settled into that ugly silence grief leaves behind, my father closed the kitchen door and Dana stood beside him with her arms folded. The dishwasher hummed. Someone had left a half-cut lemon on the counter. Ordinary details made it feel unreal. My father said if the ring had truly been a gift, my mother would have put it in writing. I asked him if he had put Dana's college car in writing when he handed her the keys. He ignored that. Dana said Mom had been confused in those final months and that I had probably taken advantage of a sentimental moment. She used those exact words. Not theft. Not yet. Something softer that still made me sound stained. I told them both exactly what had happened in the studio. I described the chair, the lamps, the painter wiping his brushes on a rag streaked with blue. I described my mother's hand over mine. My father looked at me the same way he had looked at unpaid bills and bad weather, annoyed by the inconvenience. "You always did know how to make a story feel true," he said. That was the breaking point. Not the accusation itself. Not even Dana's smug little silence. It was hearing my father reduce one of the only tender moments my mother had ever claimed for me into performance. I went upstairs, packed a suitcase, and left before midnight. It was raining hard enough to blur the porch light. I remember standing at the top of the steps for 1 second too long, suitcase in one hand, the other wrapped around the railing slick with water. No one came after me. No one called my name. I drove to a motel off the highway with thin towels and a buzzing ice machine outside my window, and around 3 in the morning, I finally took the ring off just to make sure it was still real. The next week, I moved to Columbus. I found an apartment above an old bakery where the walls were so thin I could hear the couple next door argue about laundry and rent. I slept on a mattress on the floor for the first month. I ate canned tomato soup with toast because it was cheap and warm and could stretch for 2 meals if I was careful. During the day, I applied for office jobs, front desk jobs, anything steady. Twice a week, sometimes more, I got polite rejection emails that thanked me for my time. Loneliness has a shape to it. Mine looked like a single fork drying on a dish towel. It looked like unopened mail stacked near the door because I was tired of every envelope asking for money. It looked like waking up from a dream about my mother and spending the first few seconds of morning trying to remember where I was. A few weeks later, something unexpected arrived in the mail. It was a letter from the probate attorney handling my mother's estate. My father had informed him that a disputed family heirloom was in my possession and requested its return pending review. The letter was polite. That somehow made it worse. My whole life had been reduced to stationery and careful wording. I folded it back along its crease and sat at my small kitchen table until the light outside turned from white to gray. I almost mailed the ring back that night. Instead, I put it in a chipped ceramic bowl beside my bed and told myself I would decide in the morning. That night, I learned something I had not understood before. Survival is often made of ordinary things. Paying the power bill on time. Getting out of bed when no one is waiting for you. Walking into one more interview with your shoulders back, even after the last 6 doors closed in your face. Months passed. I took a receptionist job at a copy and print shop near Broad Street. The owner, Mr. Levin, was patient and exacting. He taught me how to trim presentation boards cleanly, how to match paperweights, how to spot a bent frame corner from across the room. I liked work that asked for care instead of charm. In the evenings, I stayed late and helped repair damaged frames people brought in from thrift stores and attics. There was something calming about straightening what had warped. One afternoon, a woman came in with an old family photograph whose frame backing had split open. I fixed it while she waited. The next week, she returned with 2 more pieces and insisted on paying me in cash. She told her church friend about me. Then a realtor brought in cheap landscape prints that needed reframing before an open house. Then a cafe owner asked if I could mount local artwork for her walls. What I learned the following week changed everything. Mr. Levin offered me a raise and a small corner workspace in the back where I could take on restoration jobs under the shop's name for a percentage. It was not a miracle. It was better than that. It was a beginning. I paid one overdue bill, then another. I bought a second-hand desk. I stopped jumping every time the mail slot clattered. 3 years after I left home, I had saved enough to lease a narrow storefront with flaking white paint and a front window that looked onto a bus stop. I called it Mercer Frame and Paper, then stared at the sign for a long time before deciding to keep the name. I was tired of acting as if everything attached to my family had to be abandoned in order for me to be clean. My first month there, I had 6 customers and 1 good week followed by 2 bad ones. In winter, I kept a space heater near my desk and wore fingerless gloves while I worked. A retired teacher named Gloria brought me old botanical prints to clean and mount. A wedding planner asked me to rescue smoke-damaged table photos after a kitchen accident. I learned how to stretch $40 across a weekend. I learned which days the bakery down the block sold leftover rolls at half price after noon. Quiet triumph never sounds the way people imagine. Sometimes it sounds like a receipt printing. Sometimes it sounds like your own key in a door you can finally afford. By the 5th year, I had one part-time employee, a patient college student named Nina, who could wrap finished frames so neatly they looked like gifts. I was not wealthy. I was not famous. But the rent was paid. The lights stayed on. On cold evenings, I locked up and walked home carrying a loaf of bread under my arm, and that felt like a life. Then Dana found a way to reach me again. A woman from my hometown came into the shop with 2 cracked watercolor prints. She hesitated when she saw my last name on the wall. "Are you Richard Mercer's daughter?" she asked. I said yes. Her face changed in the smallest way. She grew careful. Too careful. When she came back to pick up the prints, she mentioned, almost apologetically, that she had run into Dana over Christmas. "She said your mother's ring was never recovered," she said. Never recovered. That was how the story had evolved in my absence. Not disputed, not painful. Stolen. I smiled, handed her the package, and waited until she left before sitting down in the back room with my hands flat on the work table. It was late afternoon. Rain tapped softly against the back window. Nina asked if I was all right, and I said yes, because explaining family shame to someone 20 years old felt like making her carry a box that was never hers. The lie had kept working even after I left. That was the part I had not planned for. Have you ever been judged by people who had already chosen their version of you before you even opened your mouth? That kind of judgment does not need facts. It only needs repetition. I used to wonder how many daughters had sat alone in small businesses they built with their own hands, realizing the people back home were still introducing them as the family disappointment. A month later, on a bright Tuesday when the shop smelled like dust and mat board, a man in his 50s walked in carrying a flat archival box. He wore a tan coat, damp at the shoulders from a quick spring shower. He asked if I was Claire Mercer. When I said yes, he set the box down very carefully and introduced himself as Adrian Bell. He had once worked as the assistant to Samuel Pike, the painter who had made my mother's portrait. At first, I thought he wanted it reframed. Instead, he told me my father had recently contacted the Pike estate about cleaning the painting before selling it. Medical bills, he said. Or perhaps debt. He did not know. Adrian had been cataloging old reference materials from past commissions before the portrait was sent out. When he found the Mercer file, he saw my name and the date. He almost left it there. Then he noticed the notes attached to the proofs. My mouth went dry. I asked him what kind of notes. He opened the box. Inside were large printed reference photographs from the portrait sitting, each protected in clear sleeves. In the first, my mother sat between Dana and me under the studio lights. In the second, Dana was out of frame, and my mother was leaning toward me, her fingers around my wrist. In the third, my hand was resting open in my lap, and the emerald ring was unmistakably on my finger. For a moment, the room went completely still. Then Adrian slid a small cream card from an envelope tucked behind the proofs. It was addressed in my mother's handwriting to Samuel Pike. "Please leave the hands exactly as they are," it read. "The ring was given today, and I want it remembered truthfully." I sat down because my knees would not hold me. Adrian said my father had likely never seen the full proofs. Most clients did not. But the painting itself had preserved the same detail. It had been there all along, just too small for anyone to bother looking. He had brought everything because, in his words, some things should not be buried simply because a family is tired of them. The truth doesn't always arrive when you want it. It arrives when it's ready. I cried only once, and quietly. Adrian pretended not to notice. He asked if I wanted copies. I said yes. He asked if I had legal representation. I said not exactly. Before he left, he gave me the card of an attorney who handled estate disputes with more patience than drama. That evening, after Nina went home, I locked the shop and sat alone under the front window with the proofs spread across my desk. Outside, the buses hissed at the curb and people passed carrying groceries and umbrellas. Inside, my mother's hand was reaching for mine from a moment preserved before everything broke. I wasn't there to fight. I wasn't there to argue. I was there for one reason only. I wanted the truth said out loud by people who had spent years pretending not to hear it. Helen Sloan, the attorney Adrian recommended, had a small office above a dentist's practice and a voice so calm it made panic feel unnecessary. She reviewed the proofs, the note, and the probate letter from years earlier. Then she smiled in a way that was not warm but deeply reassuring. "They accused you because they assumed memory would do what evidence hadn't," she said. She arranged a formal meeting at her office with my father and Dana under the pretense of resolving the estate claim before the sale of the portrait moved forward. I did not sleep much the night before. The sky was white with low clouds the next morning, and the air smelled like wet pavement when I parked. By the time I arrived, my father was already in the waiting room. He looked older than I expected. Smaller, too. Dana sat beside him in a cream coat, her expression fixed somewhere between annoyance and confidence. For one strange second, I saw all of us at once. The years between us, the same last name, the same faces trying to pretend none of it had cost anything. We took our seats around Helen's conference table. Adrian came in last, carrying the archival box. My father frowned when he saw it. Helen began with simple facts. There had been a claim. There was now evidence. She passed around enlarged prints first, letting silence do its work. Dana picked one up, glanced at it, then set it back down too quickly. My father leaned forward. I watched his eyes move from my mother's face to her hand to mine. No one spoke. Then Adrian laid the note in the center of the table. My father read it twice. Dana did not touch it at all. For the first time in years, the room was not waiting for me to defend myself. It was waiting for them to explain themselves. My father cleared his throat. He said he had not known. Dana said Mom had been confused. Adrian answered before I could. He explained the date of the sitting, the sequence of the proofs, the painter's practice of recording client instructions immediately after each session. Helen added that continuing the accusation after receiving this evidence would expose them to more than embarrassment. Dana turned toward me then, not ashamed, just cornered. "Why didn't you show us this before?" It was such a perfect question that I almost smiled. "I did tell you," I said. "You only wanted paper when the truth came from me." No one had an answer to that. My father looked at the enlarged portrait again. His shoulders dropped in a way I had never seen before, as if the effort of holding our family story together had finally become heavier than the story itself. He said my mother should have told him. It was the closest thing to regret he seemed capable of. Even then, he could not quite place responsibility where it belonged. I did not push him. I did not ask for an apology shaped the exact way I deserved. Some debts are too old to be collected cleanly. Helen stated that the claim against me would be withdrawn immediately and that a written retraction would be sent to the probate file. She also requested that any future representation about the ring acknowledge it as a documented gift from Ellen Mercer to her daughter, Claire Mercer. My name looked strange on the page when she turned the document toward me for review. Not because it was unfamiliar, because it had finally been written beside the truth. My father asked if we could talk outside after. I said yes because I no longer feared what he might say. We stood under the narrow awning by the parking lot while a light rain began to fall. Cars moved slowly along the street. Water gathered in the cracked lines of the asphalt. My father kept his eyes on the road instead of on me. "I thought I was protecting order," he said at last. That was the language he would choose. Not Dana, not image. Order. I looked at him and saw a man who had spent a lifetime mistaking control for fairness. "You were protecting the version of the family that made you comfortable," I said. He nodded once. No argument, no defense. Just a small movement that arrived far too late. Then he asked if I would come by the house sometime. Not that day. Sometime. I understood what he meant. He wanted a path back that did not require him to name the full distance between us. "I hope you take care of yourself," I said. It was not forgiveness. It was not cruelty either. It was all I had. I walked to my car with the ring warm against my skin and the copies of the proofs tucked inside my bag. I did not feel victorious. I felt clear. There is a difference. My mother had not saved me with the ring. Adrian had not saved me with the evidence. The business, the apartment, the long winters, the unpaid bills, the mornings I opened my own shop in the dark, all of that had done the slower work. By the time the truth arrived, I was no longer waiting for it to build me a life. I was already living one. When I got home that evening, I unlocked the shop first out of habit and stood for a moment inside the quiet front room. Nina had left the wrapping paper stacked neatly by the cutter. A finished frame waited on the pickup shelf. Outside, the bus stop bench glistened from the rain, and the streetlights had begun to come on one by one. I took the largest proof from my bag and leaned it against the wall behind my desk. Not the full portrait, just the close view of my mother's hand over mine. I stood there looking at it until the room softened. I never needed their approval to become who I was meant to be. Later, I turned off the lights, locked the door, and walked to my car under a clearing sky. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still held its shine. I sat behind the wheel with one hand resting on the key and the other on the ring my mother had given me years before, and for the first time in a very long while, the night outside the windshield looked quiet enough to trust.